If you've got $6, prove it, or get out. Ryan Cole's voice cut clean through the low hum of clinking glasses and muted conversation, sharp enough that even the bartender paused mid-pour, the amber stream of bourbon hanging for a fraction too long before hitting the glass, and then, like a ripple catching fire, laughter broke out across the room, light at first, then louder, bolder, people turning in their seats, shoulders shaking. Eyes locking onto the man standing near the counter as if he were part of the evening's entertainment. Rather than a person who had simply walked in from the cold, Elijah Carter didn't move, not right away. His coat hung loose around his frame, worn at the edges, the fabric holding on to the faint gray of the city outside, and for a moment he just stood there, breathing slow, steady, as if the noise around him belonged to another place entirely, while overhead the soft yellow lights cast a warm glow that didn't quite reach him, leaving the lines of his face half in shadow, half revealed. Someone at a nearby table leaned in and whispered something that sparked another round of laughter. A woman lifted her phone just slightly, not obvious, but enough, the lens angled, waiting, capturing, because moments like this traveled fast, because humiliation had a way of becoming content. Ryan stepped closer, one hand resting against the polished edge of the counter, fingers tapping once, twice, impatience dressed as authority. His shirt crisp, sleeves rolled just enough to suggest control without effort, the kind of posture that came from years of never being questioned, and when he spoke again, his tone dropped lower, quieter, but it carried further, threading through the room with practiced ease. "We don't run a shelter here," he said, almost conversational, and that drew another wave of chuckles, softer now, more knowing, like the room had settled into its role. Elijah's eyes lifted then, not to Ryan, not yet, but to the far wall, where a small black dome of a security camera sat, angled above the entrance, its tiny red light blinking steady, patient, watching everything without judgment, and something in his gaze lingered there just a second too long, as if recognizing an old habit, or a memory stitched into the place itself. Near the window, a child's voice piped up, unfiltered, curious in the way only children could be. "Mom, why does he look like that?" And the mother hushed him quickly, but not before a few people smirked, not before the question settled into the air like dust that no one bothered to brush away. Elijah shifted his weight, just slightly, the movement almost invisible, his hands steady at his sides, no clenched fists, no raised voice, just a quiet presence that didn't match the role the room had assigned him, and that mismatch, subtle as it was, created a faint tension. Beneath the laughter, something that didn't quite belong. Ryan exhaled through his nose, a small sound of amusement, then reached for a receipt pad as if to finalize the moment, to wrap it up neatly. $6, he repeated, tapping the pen against the paper. "That's all it takes." And he slid the pad forward an inch, the motion deliberate, performative, inviting the room to watch the conclusion. Somewhere behind the bar, a glass was set down a little too hard, the sound sharper than it needed to be, and for a brief second the rhythm of the room faltered, like a skipped beat in a familiar song, but the laughter returned quickly, filling the gap, covering it. Elijah finally looked at Ryan then, really looked at him, not with anger, not with pleading, but with a kind of calm that felt out of place under the circumstances, the kind of calm that didn't ask for permission, and as he reached slowly into his coat pocket, the movement unhurried, measured, the room leaned in without realizing it, conversations thinning, forks pausing halfway to mouths, because something about the way he moved suggested that this moment wasn't ending the way they expected, and even the laughter, still present, began to lose its certainty, softening at the edges, as if the room itself was starting to listen instead of perform. The bills came out folded, edges worn soft from being handled too many times, not crisp, not new, but real, and Elijah placed them on the counter one by one, slow enough that each motion seemed to stretch the silence just a little further. A single dollar, then another, until the small stack sat there between him and Ryan like something heavier than it should have been, and for a moment no one spoke. Because the scene they had already decided in their heads was beginning to shift in a way that felt almost uncomfortable. Ryan glanced down at the money, then back up at Elijah, the faint smile still there but thinner now, less certain, as if it had lost some of its foundation. "That does not mean you belong here," he said, his voice still controlled, but the ease from before had tightened just slightly, enough that someone close to him might have noticed, enough that the bartender, now wiping the same spot on the counter for the third time, slowed his hand without realizing it. Elijah did not respond immediately, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the counter, not gripping, not tapping, just there, grounded, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, carrying a weight that did not need volume to be heard. "I am not asking to belong," he said, each word measured. "I am asking to finish what I started." And that sentence hung in the air differently than anything before it, not sharp, not loud, but anchored like. It had roots somewhere deeper than the moment itself. A man near the back let out a short laugh, uncertain this time, as if checking whether it was still appropriate, and when no one immediately joined him, the sound faded quickly, swallowed by the growing quiet that was spreading through the room like a slow tide. Ryan straightened slightly, his posture adjusting, recalibrating. "You started nothing here," he replied, a little quicker than before, as if trying to regain control of a conversation that was no longer entirely his, and he slid the receipt pad a little farther forward, the paper catching the light, bright against the darker wood. "You walked in, that is all." But Elijah's gaze did not follow the pad, did not drop to the money. Instead it moved again, briefly, toward the walls, the fixtures, the small details that most people never noticed, the way the light reflected off the framed photographs near the entrance, the slight tilt of a sign that had not been adjusted in a long time, the worn edge of a booth in the far corner, and there was something in the way he looked at those things, something familiar, like someone remembering rather than discovering. A server paused mid-step, tray balanced carefully in one hand, her eyes flicking between the two men, and for a second she forgot where she was supposed to be going. Elijah's hand moved again, this time reaching into his coat once more, but slower, more deliberate, and when he pulled it out, it was not money this time, but a small object, metallic, catching the overhead light in a brief, sharp glint before settling into his palm, a key, old but well kept, its surface marked by years of use. And he set it gently on the counter beside the bills, not sliding it, not presenting it, just placing it there as if it belonged. The sound it made was soft, almost lost beneath the hum of the room, but the effect was not, because something about it, something about that small, ordinary object, shifted the attention in a way that laughter never could, drawing eyes, pulling focus, and even Ryan's gaze dropped to it for a fraction longer than he intended. "What is that supposed to be?" Ryan asked, and this time the question came with less certainty, less performance, more curiosity edged with something he did not quite recognize yet. Elijah looked at the key for a moment, then back up, and the calm in his expression had not changed, but there was something else now, something closer to quiet resolve. "It is not supposed to be anything," he said. "It already is." And that answer did not explain anything, not directly, but it deepened the silence, thickened it, until even the small background noises of the restaurant seemed to recede, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something none of them could fully name but all of them could feel approaching. Ryan did not touch the key at first, his fingers hovering just above the counter as if the small piece of metal carried more weight than it should have, and for the first time since Elijah had walked in, there was a pause that belonged entirely to him, not the room, not the crowd, just him, recalculating, reassessing, because something in the way that key had been placed there did not match the story he had already decided. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be," he said. Finally, but the words lacked the sharp edge they had carried before, and when he glanced around, the room that had supported him moments ago was no longer as loud, no longer as certain, people watching now instead of participating, their expressions shifting from amusement to curiosity, from certainty to something quieter. Elijah remained still, his posture unchanged, his hand no longer on the key, leaving it there alone on the polished wood, reflecting a thin line of light, and when he spoke, it was not to argue, not to defend, but simply to continue. "Table 12, he said, his voice steady. "Near the window, third booth from the door." And the specificity of it landed differently, precise in a way that did not feel guessed, did not feel imagined. A server near the corner turned instinctively, her eyes moving toward that exact spot as if pulled by the words themselves, and for a brief second her brow furrowed, recognition flickering without fully forming. Ryan followed her glance, just for a moment, then looked back at Elijah, a faint crease forming between his brows. "Anyone can point at a table," he replied, but this time there was a question hidden inside the statement, a small crack in the certainty he had been holding on to. Elijah gave a slight nod, not dismissive, not challenging, just acknowledging, and then he added, 3 years ago, Friday night, just before closing, the lights dimmed early because the storm knocked out power on the east side of the block. And now the room shifted again, more noticeably this time, because memory, real memory, had a texture to it, a weight that fiction rarely carried, and a man seated near the bar straightened slowly, his eyes narrowing as if something distant had just moved closer. The bartender stopped wiping altogether, the cloth resting against the counter, his gaze fixed not on Elijah's face but somewhere past it, as if searching through his own recollection. Ryan's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in concentration. "We have had plenty of nights," he said, though softer now. "Plenty of storms." But the defense sounded thinner than he intended, less grounded. Elijah's eyes moved once more, briefly, toward the ceiling, toward the lights that now glowed steady and warm. "Not like that one," he said. "That night the front door stuck because the humidity swelled the frame. You had to push it twice before it would close all the way." And a quiet sound came from near the entrance, the hostess, barely audible. "That happened," she murmured, almost to herself, her hand instinctively touching the door handle as if confirming something that no longer needed confirmation. The shift in the room was no longer subtle, it was present, tangible, the laughter from earlier now feeling distant, misplaced, like something that belonged to a different scene entirely. Ryan's hand lowered slowly until his fingertips brushed the edge of the key, not picking it up, just making contact. Grounding himself in something physical as the intangible began to slip, even if. "You remember a night," he said, and now there was effort in his voice, a careful construction of words instead of the effortless flow from before. "That does not make this your place." But as he spoke, his eyes flickered once more to the key, then back to Elijah, searching, measuring, and Elijah did not look away, did not press forward, he simply stood there, present, steady, as if time itself had slowed around him, waiting for something inevitable to arrive. A man at the far end of the bar leaned forward, elbows resting on the surface, his voice low but clear enough to carry. "What was the special that night?" he asked, not directed at anyone in particular, but the question hung there, bridging the space between doubt and belief, and Elijah answered without hesitation, without looking away. "Smoked ribs, $12 a plate, came with cornbread that ran out before 9. And the bartender exhaled slowly, a sound that carried more recognition than surprise, and in that moment, the balance in the room tipped just a little further, away from assumption, towards something else entirely. The bartender set the glass down slowly, more careful than before, as if any sudden movement might break whatever fragile shift had taken hold in the room, and he leaned forward just enough to get a clearer look at Elijah, his eyes narrowing not in suspicion but in recognition that had not fully formed yet. "We did run out before 9, he said quietly, almost reluctant, as if admitting it meant stepping into something he did not yet understand. The man at the far end of the bar nodded once, more to himself than anyone else, his gaze now fixed on Elijah with a different kind of attention, one that measured instead of dismissed. Ryan's fingers curled slightly around the edge of the counter, his posture no longer as relaxed, his shoulders tightening in a way that suggested he was holding on to control rather than embodying it. "That still does not prove anything," he said, but the words came slower now, each one placed more carefully, as if he were testing them before letting them go. Elijah did not challenge the statement, did not argue, he simply inclined his head a fraction, acknowledging the point without surrendering anything, and then he spoke again, his voice carrying the same calm weight. "Check the register logs from that night," he said. "There was a card that declined 3 times at table 12, and someone covered it before the customer noticed." And this time the reaction was immediate, a soft intake of breath from somewhere near the kitchen, a server stepping forward half a pace before stopping herself, her hand hovering near her chest as memory caught up with her. Ryan turned toward her instinctively, his eyes searching her face for confirmation he had not asked for out loud, and she hesitated, just long enough for the silence to deepen, then nodded once, small but unmistakable. "That did happen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, and now the room was no longer shifting, it had shifted, the earlier laughter replaced entirely by something heavier, something that asked questions instead of answering them. Ryan straightened, but the motion lacked its earlier confidence, more reflex than intention. "Even if you were here that night," he said, and there was strain now, subtle but present, "that does not give you any claim." But as he spoke, his eyes flickered again to the key resting on the counter, and this time he did not look away as quickly. Elijah followed that glance, just briefly, then returned his gaze to Ryan, steady, patient, as if he had already seen this moment unfold before. "I am not here to claim anything," he said, and the simplicity of it landed harder than anything else, stripping away the assumptions that had framed the entire encounter. A woman seated near the window lowered her phone slowly, no longer recording, her attention fully drawn into the moment, and even the child who had spoken earlier now sat quietly, watching without understanding why the room felt different. Ryan exhaled, a controlled breath that did not quite steady him the way he intended, and then, almost without realizing it, he picked up the key, the metal cool against his fingers, heavier than it should have been, and he turned it slightly, the overhead light catching along its worn edges, revealing faint markings that had been smoothed by years of use. "Where did you get this?" he asked, and the question came out more direct than before, less guarded, because something in him had shifted from dismissal to investigation. Elijah's eyes dropped to the key for a brief second, then lifted again, meeting Ryan's gaze without hesitation. "You already know," he said, and that answer did not raise his voice, did not push forward, but it landed with a quiet certainty that made it difficult to dismiss. The bartender stepped closer now, setting the cloth aside entirely, his focus fixed on the key in Ryan's hand. "That looks like the original back office key," he said slowly, each word deliberate, as if he were testing a memory against the present. "We replaced those 2 years ago." And Ryan's grip tightened just slightly, his thumb tracing the edge of the metal as if searching for something he had overlooked. Elijah did not move, did not press, he simply stood there, the same calm presence in the center of a room that no longer knew what to do with him. And in that stillness, the balance continued to tilt, not through force, not through volume, but through something quieter, something that could not be laughed away anymore. Ryan turned the key once more between his fingers, slower now, as if the motion itself might unlock something he had not yet fully grasped, and the faint engraving along its side caught the light just enough to reveal a worn set of initials, barely visible unless you knew to look for them, and his eyes narrowed, focusing, tracing the letters with his thumb as the room held its breath around him. "That cannot be," he said under his breath, though the words were not meant to carry, they did. Slipping into the quiet space that had replaced the earlier noise, and the bartender leaned in slightly, squinting, his own memory lining up with what he was beginning to see. "Those initials," the bartender murmured. "They were on the old locks, back when this place first opened." And that detail landed heavier than anything before it, because it did not belong to a random night, or a passing memory, it belonged to the beginning. Ryan's posture shifted again, less rigid now, more uncertain, as if the ground beneath his assumptions had begun to soften, and he looked up at Elijah, really looked this time, not at the coat, not at the surface, but at the man himself, searching for something that had been invisible to him just minutes ago. Elijah did not rush the moment, did not fill the silence, he allowed it to stretch, to settle, to do its work. His presence steady, unshaken, as if he had been here before, in rooms that needed time to catch up to the truth standing in front of them. A chair scraped softly somewhere near the back as someone adjusted their seat, the sound louder than it should have been in the stillness, and a few heads turned, not out of distraction, but because every small movement now felt amplified, like the room had become hyper-aware of itself. Ryan placed the key back down on the counter, but not where it had been before. This time closer to him, as if proximity might help him. understand it better, and his voice, when he spoke again, had changed, the sharpness gone, replaced by something more cautious, more deliberate. If this is what I think it is, he said slowly, choosing each word with care, then you need to explain why you are here like this. And the emphasis was subtle, but it carried the weight of everything that had come before, the laughter, the dismissal, the assumptions now sitting uncomfortably in the space between them. Elijah's gaze softened just slightly, not in weakness, but in recognition of the shift, and he nodded once, a small, controlled motion that acknowledged the question without rushing to answer it, and for a moment he looked past Ryan, toward the window where the city lights reflected faintly against the glass, blurred by the evening air, and when he spoke, his voice carried a different kind of weight now, not just calm, but layered with something older, something lived. Because places change, he said, the words simple, but anchored in something deeper. And people forget who built them. And that sentence did not rise, did not demand attention, but it settled into the room in a way that made it impossible to ignore. The bartender exhaled quietly, almost like a confirmation to himself, and the server who had spoken earlier stepped a little closer now, no longer hesitant, her eyes moving between Elijah and the key as if connecting pieces that had been scattered. Ryan's jaw tightened again, but not in resistance, more in realization, the kind that comes slowly but lands all at once, and he reached for the key again, this time lifting it fully, holding it up slightly as if seeing it from a different angle might change what it meant, but it did not. It only confirmed it. You are saying, he began, then paused, the words catching as he recalibrated. You are saying this place was yours. And the room seemed to lean in at that, not physically, but in attention, in focus, every eye drawn to Elijah as if the answer mattered more than anything else happening in their evening. Elijah did not smile, did not take satisfaction in the moment, he simply met Ryan's gaze and let a brief silence pass before responding. I am saying I was here before it became what you see now. And the distinction mattered, the phrasing deliberate, because it did not claim ownership in the way Ryan expected, it claimed something else, something harder to dismiss. A man near the bar shook his head slightly, not in disagreement, but in disbelief at how quickly the narrative had shifted, and the woman by the window leaned forward, her earlier amusement completely gone, replaced by quiet attention. Ryan lowered the key slowly, placing it back on the counter with more care than before, and for the first time since this began, he did not have an immediate response, no quick remark, no easy dismissal, just silence, and in that silence, the balance that had once favored him now hung uncertainly, tipping towards something he was only beginning to understand. The silence did not break, it deepened, stretching across the room until even the faint hum of the refrigerator behind the bar seemed distant, like it belonged to another place entirely. And Elijah did not move to fill it, he did not step forward or raise his voice, he simply stood there, breathing slow, steady, as if he had learned long ago that truth did not need to rush, that it arrived on its own time and settled where it was meant to. Ryan remained still as well, but his stillness was different, less grounded, more searching, his eyes drifting from Elijah to the key, then to the walls, the tables, the small details he had passed 1,000 times without noticing, and now each of them seemed to carry a question he could not immediately answer. Near the window, the reflection of the streetlights shimmered faintly against the glass, soft and distorted, and for a moment Elijah's gaze followed that reflection, not escaping the room, but anchoring himself within it, as if he were measuring the distance between what this place had been and what it had become. A quiet sound came from the bartender as he shifted his weight, resting both hands on the counter, no longer pretending to work, his attention fully present. I remember the old layout, he said slowly, not addressing anyone directly, more like speaking into the space itself. Before the renovation, before the new menu, before the name change. And the words carried a quiet confirmation that did not need to be argued. Ryan's head turned slightly toward him, the movement subtle but telling, because now he was listening, not leading, and that shift, small as it was, changed the balance of the entire room. Elijah nodded once, acknowledging the memory without claiming it, and then he spoke again, his voice softer now, but somehow clearer. There was a photograph behind the counter, he said. Black and white, just above the shelf with the glasses, a picture of the first night this place opened, everyone standing outside, smiling like they had built something that would last. And as he spoke, the bartender's eyes widened just slightly, his gaze flicking to the wall behind him where a newer frame now hung, larger, brighter, but missing something he had never quite been able to name. "That photo was taken down," the bartender said, almost instinctively, and then, after a brief pause, "They said it did not fit the new design." And the room absorbed that detail in silence, because it was not just about a photograph, it was about what had been removed, what had been replaced, what had been forgotten. Ryan's fingers pressed lightly against the counter, his posture no longer defensive, but unsettled, and he looked at Elijah again, this time with something closer to recognition, though it had not fully formed yet. "If you were here before," he said, his voice quieter than it had ever been, "then why did you leave?" And the question did not come with accusation, it came with confusion, with the need to understand something that no longer fit into the simple narrative he had started with. Elijah's expression did not change dramatically, but there was a subtle shift, a weight that settled behind his eyes, and he did not answer immediately, allowing the question to exist for a moment, to breathe, to carry its own gravity before responding. And when he did, his voice held something deeper now, something that reached beyond the room itself. "I did not leave," he said. "Not the way you think." And the phrasing mattered, it opened a door without fully stepping through it. A faint movement near the back caught attention as someone set their phone down completely, no longer recording, no longer observing from a distance, but present in a way that felt more human, more engaged. Ryan exhaled slowly, his breath measured, as if he were trying to align himself with a reality that had shifted too quickly, and his gaze dropped once more to the key, still resting between them, a small object that now seemed to hold more truth than anything else in the room. Elijah followed that glance briefly, then lifted his eyes again, steady, unwavering, and in that stillness, something passed between them, not spoken, not declared, but understood in a way that did not need words, and for the first time since the moment had begun. The room was no longer waiting for Elijah to prove something, it was waiting for Ryan to understand it. Ryan's lips parted slightly, as if a response was forming, but nothing came out at first, and that absence of words carried more weight than anything he had said before, because it revealed something unfamiliar to him, hesitation, not from lack of authority, but from the realization that authority alone could not resolve what was unfolding. His gaze lifted from the key and settled fully on Elijah now, not scanning, not judging, but searching with intent, as if trying to reconcile two versions of the same space, the one he believed he managed and the one that was being quietly revealed in front of him. "Then how?" Ryan began, his voice lower, stripped of its earlier sharpness. "How does someone go from that to this?" And he did not gesture, did not point, but the meaning was clear. The contrast hanging in the air without needing to be named. Elijah did not react to the implication, not outwardly, his expression remaining steady. But there was a pause before he answered, not a defensive pause, not avoidance, but the kind that comes from choosing the right truth rather than the easiest one, and when he spoke, his voice carried a calm that felt earned, not performed. "Because what people build is not always what they get to keep," he said, and the words settled into the room. Like something that had been waiting to be heard, a quiet shift moved through the crowd, not physical, but emotional, the kind that changes how people sit, how they look at one another, how they listen, and the man at the bar who had spoken earlier lowered his gaze for a moment, as if recognizing something personal in the statement. Ryan's brow tightened slightly, not in disagreement, but in thought. And he turned his head just enough to glance toward the back hallway, where the office door sat closed, a place he had entered countless times without ever considering what came before him, and now that door seemed different, heavier, like it held a history he had never been part of. "The records say this place changed ownership," Ryan said, more carefully now, as if stepping through unfamiliar ground. "Years ago, before I came on." And his voice carried a subtle uncertainty, because the records had always been enough before, but now they felt incomplete. Elijah nodded once, acknowledging the truth of that statement without confirming its whole meaning, and his eyes moved briefly toward the same hallway, the same door, but there was no longing in the look, no regret, just recognition, as if he were seeing something that had already been resolved within him. "Records tell you who signed the papers," Elijah said. "They do not tell you who stood here when the lights first turned on." And that distinction landed with a quiet force, drawing a clear line between ownership and origin. Between what is documented and what is lived. The bartender let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly, not in disbelief anymore, but in understanding that was arriving piece by piece, and the server who had confirmed the earlier memory took another small step closer, her posture no longer hesitant, her attention fully anchored in the moment. Ryan's hand moved again, almost unconsciously, resting flat against the counter, grounding himself as the conversation moved beyond the surface level he was used to navigating, and he looked down briefly, then back up, his voice quieter still. "So you built this place," he said, not as a challenge, not as a statement of authority, but as a question that he needed answered clearly, because everything now seemed to hinge on it. Elijah met his gaze without hesitation, and for a moment the room seemed to narrow to just the two of them, the rest of the world fading into the background, and then he gave a small nod, not dramatic, not emphasized, just enough to confirm what had already begun to take shape in everyone's mind. The effect was immediate, not loud, not explosive, but undeniable, like a shift in gravity that no one could ignore, and a faint sound moved through the room, not laughter, not conversation, but something closer to a collective exhale, as if everyone had been holding on to a version of the moment that no longer fit. Ryan blinked once, slowly, the confirmation settling in, rearranging everything that had come before it, the words he had said, the way he had stood, the assumptions he had made, and for the first time since this began, he did not try to regain control of the situation, he did not reach for authority or structure, he simply stood there, facing the reality that had been placed in front of him, and in that stillness, the room no longer waited for proof, it waited for what he would do with the truth now that it had arrived. Ryan did not look away this time, not from Elijah, not from the weight of what had just been confirmed, and the shift in him was no longer subtle, it was visible in the way his shoulders lowered slightly, in the way his stance adjusted from guarded to grounded, as if he had stepped out of a role he had been playing without realizing it. The key still rested near his hand, but he did not reach for it again, not immediately. Instead he let the moment breathe, let the truth settle into the space between them, and when he finally spoke, his voice had changed completely, no sharp edges, no performance, just something quieter, more deliberate. "I did not." "No," he said, and the simplicity of the statement carried a weight that extended beyond the words themselves, because it was not just about information, it was about everything that had come before it. Elijah nodded once, not in agreement, not in dismissal, but in acknowledgement, as if the statement had been expected, as if it was part of a process that had already unfolded in his mind long before this moment. A chair shifted softly near the back as someone adjusted their position, but no one spoke, no one interrupted, the room now fully aligned with a different kind of attention, one that did not seek entertainment but understanding. Ryan's gaze dropped briefly to the counter, to the bills Elijah had placed there earlier, still untouched, still exactly where they had been left, and he hesitated for a fraction of a second before reaching out and sliding them back toward Elijah, not quickly, not dramatically. Just a quiet motion that reversed the direction of the entire interaction. "You do not owe anything," he said, and the words were steady, not forced, not rehearsed, but real in a way that could be felt rather than measured. Elijah looked down at the money for a brief moment, then back up, his expression unchanged, calm, steady, and he did not immediately take it, allowing the gesture to exist on its own, to mean what it needed to mean without rushing to complete it. Ryan continued, his voice still low, still controlled, but now carrying something new, something closer to humility than authority. "I made an assumption," he said, and this time the admission did not hide behind phrasing or deflection, it stood alone, clear, unguarded, and the room absorbed it in silence, because it was not just an apology, it was a recognition of something deeper. Elijah's gaze softened slightly, not with approval, not with forgiveness in a dramatic sense, but with a quiet understanding, The kind that does not need to be spoken out loud, and after a brief pause, he reached forward and picked up the bills, folding them once before slipping them back into his coat pocket, not because he needed them, not because he had been rejected, but because the moment had shifted beyond the transaction entirely. The bartender stepped back slowly, giving space without being asked, his earlier tension replaced by a quiet respect that showed in the way he moved, and the server who had been watching let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, her shoulders relaxing as the weight of the moment began to settle. Ryan's hand moved again, this time toward the key, but instead of holding it, he turned it gently and slid it across the counter toward Elijah, the motion careful, deliberate, as if returning something that had never truly belonged to him. "This is yours," he said, and the statement carried no question, no doubt, just a recognition that had finally reached its full form. Elijah looked at the key, then at Ryan, and for a moment he did not move, allowing the gesture to stand on its own, to complete the arc that had begun with laughter and now ended in something entirely different. And when he finally reached for it, his fingers closed around the metal with a familiarity that needed no explanation. A connection that had always been there whether anyone else saw it or not. Ryan straightened slightly, but not in the way he had before, not with control, but with clarity, and he met Elijah's gaze once more, this time without distance, without hierarchy, just two people standing in the same space, understanding the same truth, and in that moment, the room was no longer divided by roles or assumptions, it was held together by something quieter, something that did not need to be announced. Because everyone there could feel it settling into place. Elijah closed his hand around the key and let it rest there for a moment, not gripping it tightly, just holding it with the quiet familiarity of someone who had carried its meaning far longer than its weight, and then he slipped it gently into his coat pocket, the motion unhurried, almost ceremonial in its simplicity, as if returning something to its rightful place within himself rather than claiming anything from the room. Ryan watched the movement without interruption, his posture steady, his expression no longer searching but settled, and the space between them, once filled with tension and assumption, now felt clear, open, like something that had finally been understood without needing to be explained further. A soft sound came from the window as the evening air shifted outside, the faint glow of streetlights reflecting across the glass, stretching long lines of light that moved slightly with each passing car, and Elijah's gaze followed that reflection for just a second before returning to the room, taking it in not as a stranger anymore, but not quite as an owner either, something in between, something quieter. The bartender cleared his throat softly, not to break the silence, but to acknowledge it, and he nodded once in Elijah's direction, a small gesture, respectful, unspoken. And the server beside him mirrored it without realizing, her shoulders relaxed now, her earlier tension replaced by something closer to calm. Ryan's hand rested flat on the counter, fingers spread slightly as if grounding himself in the moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried no weight of authority, no attempt to correct or control, just a simple steadiness. "If you ever want to come back," he said, pausing briefly as if choosing each word with care, "it would not be as a guest." And the sentence was left open, not finished, not defined, because the meaning did not need to be spelled out, it already existed in the space between them. Elijah looked at him, not surprised, not moved in any visible way, but there was a subtle shift in his expression, a recognition of the offer for what it was, not a repayment, not an obligation, just a gesture shaped by understanding, and he gave a small nod, acknowledging it without accepting or rejecting it outright, letting it remain what it was meant to be. A chair moved softly somewhere behind them as someone stood up, not leaving, just adjusting, and the sound carried lightly through the room, no longer disruptive, just part of the quiet rhythm that had returned. Elijah turned slightly then, not abruptly, not as if leaving in haste, but with a calm intention, his gaze passing once more across the tables, the walls, the small details that had been both familiar and distant all at once, and for a brief moment his eyes lingered on the corner near the window, the third booth, where something had begun years ago, and now existed only as memory, and then he continued, stepping toward the door with an easy, unforced motion. No one stopped him, no one called out, the room simply watched, not out of curiosity now, but out of respect, The kind that does not need to be announced because it is felt. Ryan remained where he was, his eyes following Elijah's movement, not with authority, not with control, but with a quiet awareness of what had just passed through his space, something that could not be measured in transactions or titles, something that had shifted the room without raising its voice. Elijah reached the door and paused for just a second, his hand resting on the handle, feeling the slight resistance before it gave way, just as it always had. And then he stepped outside into the evening air, the door closing behind him with a soft, final sound that did not echo, did not linger, it simply settled. Inside, the room remained still for a moment longer, and then slowly, almost imperceptibly, life resumed, glasses lifted, conversations restarted, but quieter now, more measured, as if something had been left behind that changed how everything else would continue. And Ryan stood there for a few seconds more before turning back to the counter, his hand brushing lightly over the surface where the key had been, as if confirming that the moment had been real, and in the reflection of the glass behind the bar, he caught a glimpse of himself, not as he had been when the night began, but as someone who had just learned the difference between seeing and recognizing, and the room, though it looked the same, no longer felt the same, because something quiet and undeniable had passed through it, and it would not be forgotten.